This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. We know that 50 people, including 33 parents, some of them among the rich and famous, have been indicted on fraud and related charges in Operation Varsity Blues, the U.S. Department of Justice's largest ever college admissions prosecution. We're going to talk a little bit about the scandal, but also how education reporters can take smarter approaches to their own coverage of the broader issue of inequities in post-secondary admissions. Here today to help us do all of that is Daniel Golden. He's the education editor of ProPublica. Dan, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Dan, more than a decade ago, you literally wrote the book on how the rich and famous often take a very different path to post-secondary education. It was called The Price of Admission. What was your immediate reaction when you found out about Operation Varsity Blues?
Well, it struck me that Operation Varsity Blues, the scandal that it outlined, reflected a lot of what I wrote about in my book, but also took it to a far greater extreme. So, for example, I wrote in my book about preferences for recruited athletes in niche sports like crew that are only available to a limited few students. But at least the students I wrote about who got in because they rode crew actually rode crew. In this case, bogus athletic profiles were created so that the applicants were portrayed as being rowers when actually they weren't. So it was just a particularly brazen exploitation of the vulnerabilities in the system.
Was there anything in the indictment that actually surprised you?
Well, I think I was surprised by some of the security aspects of the SAT and ACT tests. I mean, it's been written, and I was aware that the wealthy will sometimes connive to get their kids labeled as learning disabled in order to get extra time and other accommodations, even if the students aren't necessarily disabled. But I didn't realize that that enabled you to take the test with laxer security, apparently sort of by yourself in a room with just a test administrator who then in this case appears to have been bribed. So that was a loophole that the guidance counselor, in this case, the private counselor, appears to have taken advantage of, and I wasn't familiar with it.
I was also surprised about how egregious some of this was. I mean, we may be talking about some degrees and shading here, but I mean, certainly there's a difference between putting your thumb on the scale and getting your kid a little extra time and allowing somebody to Photoshop your kid's face into some other kid's body. I mean, I have to admit, I was a little bit stunned.
I was pretty stunned too, but the more I think about it, one of the other things this exposes is the industry of private college consultants and the potential abuses there. I mean, when I wrote my book, this industry was just starting to develop, and I pointed out that this was another advantage for the wealthy. They could circumvent the traditional high school guidance counselor, whose job is basically to fit the student to the college that's the best match. So the top students, they fit with the top schools, and other students, they find schools where they might flourish. But the private counselors who charge so much money, their only role is to serve the interests of the wealthy parent. If that parent says, I want to do anything I can to get my kid into the Ivy League or Stanford or Duke, that's what the consultants do. And it's not a regulated or licensed industry. These are kind of rogue players, and some of them are very responsible and thoughtful, but I think there's a big potential for abuse there. And that's one lesson that this drove home, I think.
I think it also drives home that what's going to happen is what the market will bear, what people are actually willing to pay for. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting points on that. One question I have is, has it become more difficult for some of these elite folks to get their kids into the school? Is that driving some of this desperation?
Well, as you well know, the acceptance percentages at these elite schools continue to go down. So when I wrote my book, the typical Ivy League university, maybe it accepted 15% of its applicants. And now that's probably down to somewhere between 4 or 5% and 8 or 9%. So that makes it harder for everybody. There's still a big advantage for the wealthy, but it may not be any guarantee. And from my reading of the complaint, what Singer, the guy allegedly at the heart of this scheme, what he was selling was a guarantee. he was basically saying, well, you can donate a lot of money to help your kid, but that's not necessarily a certainty. But, you do what I say, falsify the test scores so they're in the admissible range, and falsely portray them as a recruited athlete so they get the big bump for athletics. And it's a guarantee. You won't have to worry. Your kid will be accepted for sure. So he was selling certainty, and that was his calling card.
There's obviously going to be fallout here for the individuals who were indicted, but there were institutions that were also ensnared in this. We're not sure about their level of culpability yet. There have been some very strong denials by some, and already a bunch of internal investigations started. But what's next for places like Stanford and USC?
Well, I think this is a blot on their reputation. And colleges in general, while they may have been deceived in this particular case, obviously they bear some responsibility for developing and perpetuating the system that's vulnerable to this because it's tilted toward the wealthy. Also, I would expect colleges to institute some pretty obvious changes here. For example, it looks to me like one thing that Singer allegedly took advantage of is that when there were these bogus athletic profiles created, the coaches who had been bribed would then go to the admissions committee and say, here's my list, this kid is on my list. And there was no double checking of whether the kid actually was an athlete. They just took the coach's word on face value. I would think that these schools would now subject kids who are on athletic preference lists to a little greater scrutiny.
There's been some solid reporting already by education journalists putting the focus on the students who have the potential to be hurt by this scandal, as well as those who are going to get caught up in the fallout. One of those groups are students who legitimately need special education accommodations to take standardized tests. Let's talk a little bit about that.
I have seen some good reporting on it, just reconstructing what happened. And I agree that those should be focuses as well in terms of showing the broader picture. So the idea of the kids who do deserve to get in or have tremendous records or work very hard and are not getting in because it's a zero-sum game, and the children of the rich and famous with lesser records are getting in instead. I think also an interesting issue to follow up on is the individual children who benefited but are not charged. Some of them apparently did not know that their parents were getting their test scores falsified. They thought that they had achieved those scores on their own. And, I'd love to read the story of one of them and how they reacted when they learned that they had been deceived by their own parents and that they didn't get in on their own merits. I mean, that would be a poignant story if one of these children would open up about it.
There's another common theme in some of the coverage of this scandal, and that's challenging the idea that college is a meritocracy. And of course, for kids who may have been accepted under affirmative action premise, who say they already felt maybe a little out of place on campus. How does this fit into that?
People say that these kids are now going to wonder, did I deserve to get in? And that this is something that minorities sometimes wonder in college. Well, did I get in by myself or by affirmative action? But there's an awful lot of wealthy legacies and stuff who also wonder the same thing. I mean, the fact that 50 or 60% of the people are getting in on preferences means that there's a huge swath of the student body that, wonders whether they got in on their own or not. And when they suspect that they didn't, they're probably right. So, that's traditionally people talk about, oh, it's tough for minorities because they have this, self-image. Did I really get in on my own or not? Well, I mean, that's true for all these other groups too.
We're talking with Dan Golden, education editor of ProPublica, about Operation Varsity Blues and how to improve coverage of college admissions inequities. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback will help us grow. Dan, we know that there are kids who did the work, didn't get the seats. In some cases, they may have been students from underserved populations. Do we know how many spots in a typical freshman class are taken up by these kinds of preferential admissions?
Well, at the time I did my book, there were different estimates. I think one estimate was as high as 60% of slots in an Ivy League class. I mean, as you know, college admissions is a kind of panoply of preferences, and most of them aid the privilege, including legacy preference, where might be anywhere from 10 to 20 or even 25%. Athletic preference, where most of the sports are tailored to the white and wealthy, unlike, say, football and basketball, they're overbalanced by crew and fencing and horseback riding and sailing and polo and all these others. So athletic preference is quite a large percentage of students. There's the development admits, the kids of non-alumni who are just in a position to donate a lot of money. There's the children of faculty and staff. So you put all those together, you might be talking about close to half the class. And then there's a certain portion that benefit from affirmative action that might bring it up to 60% or something like that, so that the number of kids who simply get in without any preference is relatively small, and they face very large barriers.
So we've got a group of parents who are willing to cheat and a private industry that was willing to help them if the price is right. But we also have this sort of bigger societal question about how we prize selectivity and elitism as a concept. And I'm wondering, what should education reporters be cautious about in how we might be fanning some of those flames in the way that we report on college admissions?
That's a good question. I mean, as you kind of imply, even this scandal is a kind of weird backhanded tribute to the mystique of higher education, right? I mean, these parents were so desperate to get their kids into elite colleges, even though the kids were likely assured of financial security for life no matter where they went, that they were willing to commit this crime and spend all this money to bribe people. I mean, in what other country in the world would there be this kind of desperation for, education at a particular college or level of college? So, it is a mystique. And I think the only way for reporters, not necessarily to debunk it, but just to examine it, is to do a lot of digging, investigate stories based on the facts. And also, I'd be skeptical of some of the, new solutions that are promised. A lot of people in the last few days have asked me about the idea of having college admissions by way of a lottery, where you say, okay, we'll take everybody in the pool who got above 1,400 on their SATs and had a grade point average above 3.8, and then we'll just do a random selection. Well, that sounds good, but in reality, it isn't for any number of reasons. One is, if you set a grade point average of 3.8, the schools where the kids attend that will make sure that a lot of their kids get a 3.8, because those schools like to place kids in elite colleges. And then as regards test scores, I mean, I think you and I both know that a 1,400 achieved by a kid from an affluent family with a lot of test prep and tutoring who goes to a terrific high school, that's very different from a 1,400 achieved by a disadvantaged kid, maybe disadvantaged either by family income or by having to move a lot or going to a high school that doesn't have a lot of AP classes. It means a lot more. So you really can't reduce admissions to just those two criteria without slighting a lot of deserving kids, particularly those who are underprivileged. Just because this problem has been identified doesn't mean that every solution suggested is necessarily perfect.
I'd like to see more reporting on success stories like the state college systems that are doing a great job with first generation students and students from low income backgrounds. And I mean, certainly there's been plenty of studies and research that things like community colleges can be a great springboard for a lot of those kids. But I do think they get less attention, especially when they get squeezed out by a scandal like this.
I totally agree with you that they get less attention. I remember when I was a reporter for the Journal, I did what I thought was a great story about community colleges and how even though they were community colleges, they were recruiting overseas for students, and I couldn't get it on page one. And I think the attitude was our readers want to read about elite colleges; they don't necessarily want to read about community colleges, and I think that is a problem. In general, I don't write a lot of success stories, as you know. I mean, I expose problems. I don't generally praise things, but I think that we should pay state and community colleges the compliment of taking them seriously and digging into them just as hard as we dig into elite schools.
What are some good places for reporters to look for sources on college admissions? I mean, how do you build your network of contacts with people like admissions officers?
If you're looking at preferences for the wealthy in college admissions, I think the advantage a reporter starts with is that these preferences are not popular. Most Americans believe that college admissions should be based on merit and that your lineage or your wealth shouldn't have anything to do with it. And that belief extends to both guidance counselors and college admissions officers. Often it's not the admissions office that is sort of responsible for the admission of an underqualified rich kid. It's that they got pressured by the development office or the president's office because the kid's name was on a list. So I think that, it's possible to develop current or former admissions people as sources who will provide information about individuals or policies that go against merit and go against equal opportunity. So I think that's a possibility. Also, some colleges, at least in the days when I was doing the reporting, they may not make this public as much as as a result of my reporting, but they put wealthy parents on various committees, like Harvard's Committee on University Resources or other committees. And if you can find the membership of the committees, then you can double check students who have the same last names and see how the kids of the big donors seem to be doing in the admissions game.
Wow, checking for the same last name. That's a really good tip. And what about in terms of doing a little digging? I mean, as you said, you are an investigative journalist. Where should reporters be bringing some skepticism here?
One of the surprises to me here is that the athletes who had the bogus recruiting profiles, they weren't just in the niche sports like crew. At least the guy Singer boasted. I don't know if this actually came to pass or was true, but he was apparently trying to get in football recruits. Like one kid was posing as a place kicker, another kid was posing as a punter. You would think that there's so much attention to, high school football that you wouldn't be able to get away with that, but apparently it's just a rubber stamp. And I think that a good area to focus on would be athletic admissions. I mean, this is kind of a new twist. I mean, traditionally the problem in athletic admissions has been the coaches bribing other people like players so that they'll come to the school, not bribes paid to the coaches. So this really kind of sheds an interesting light on the mechanics of admitting athletes. And I'd like to see exactly how that works. What scrutiny, if any, is given to these kids? Is it if you're a top recruit, that gets more scrutiny from admissions than if you're a walk-on or the other way around? I mean, I just like to, see a story that really takes me through in great detail how the mechanics of admitting recruited athletes works and what are the loopholes and how this guy was able to exploit that system.
I also want to point out that we're talking not just about private colleges, but in some cases, elite public institutions where there are a lot of open records to be got.
That's right. There are a lot of open records from public universities. In addition to that, one place I often look when I research a university, public or private, is their Office of Institutional Research. Often they'll have on the website, they'll list the institutional research and sometimes even its documents, and you'll find that they do a lot of very interesting stuff. Like, it turned out in the Harvard lawsuit over its treatment of Asian American applicants that Harvard's own Office of Institutional Research had done reports showing that Asian Americans were disadvantaged in admissions. And so I think talking to people in institutional research, looking at some of their reports, if it's a public university, a lot of this stuff is available under public records requests. I think that's a fruitful place to go for information on admissions and other aspects of universities.
Let's say the price of admission is going to get a fresh print run and they say you can update the book. What would you change, or would there be a new epilogue?
I don't think I changed much of what I already wrote because, it's all been proven true. Not that I thought it wasn't going to be. I mean, I was pretty sure I had my finger on some important issues, but obviously a lot has happened since then that I'd have to update the Jared Kushner section. He's now, not just the son of a wealthy real estate developer, but obviously a figure of considerable national importance. I would certainly do a chapter on this case. And I think I would point out that in a lot of ways, the problem has gotten even worse because universities are ever more dependent on big donors. The percentage of alumni overall who give is going down. The small gift pools are drying up, so that makes them dependent on big donors. And then the public funding is not what it used to be for education, whether it's, research funds or state appropriations to public universities. And colleges have not done a lot to, improve the issues I pointed out. I think I changed maybe the debate, but I didn't cause a lot of reform. So I would look at this case, I'd update some of the things that happen to the individual people, and I would write about how the problem is worse than ever.
Dan, I know it's been a very busy week for you. We appreciate you making time for EWA Radio.
My pleasure. I always love to talk to you.
Dan Golden is the education editor for ProPublica. He joined us today from their offices in New York. Dan, thanks again.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody. That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.